What's up, class? Gonna be moving on here and tackling the prison letters today. So we're gonna look at Colossians, Ephesians, Philippians, and Philemon. Those are your prison epistles. All of them refer to Paul as a prisoner at some point in the letter. In the first century, prison was a place not for punishment, but for holding men for trial or execution. From which imprisonment did the apostle write? Acts records 3 imprisonments of Paul, really. He was led in Philippi, or held in Philippi at one point in chapter 16. I've actually been in that jail, or at least one like it that's still intact there in Philippi. I crawled in the jail without anybody looking. Just don't tell nobody, okay? But anyways, basically, he could hardly have written 4 letters from there because it was just an overnight stay there in Philippi. He was held in Caesarea for 2 years. Acts 24 says, verse 27, and for another 2 years at Rome in chapter 28 of Acts. Some scholars think he was also imprisoned at Ephesus, but that's a little bit uncertain. Rome is kind of the traditional site of that imprisonment. Most scholars date this Roman detention in the 60s, like AD 61, 63. Mention of Tychicus in both Ephesians 6, verse 21 and 22, and Colossians 4, 7 and 9 implies this man probably carried both letters. Mention of Onesimus in Colossians 4, 9 and Philemon 10 implies he helped Tychicus to do that. Those facts suggest Paul wrote all 3 of these letters within a fairly short period of time in the early 60s and probably from the same place. It's impossible to know in what order Paul wrote the letters. 2 of them, Philippians and Philemon, mention Paul's hope for release from custody. The other 2, Colossians and Ephesians, don't mention that. This could suggest that he wrote the former near the first of his stay in Rome when he had high hopes of release, and the latter near the end when hopes had kind of faded. Or the evidence may be read vice versa. Perhaps he wrote the latter earlier when he knew he would be in custody for a time, and the former when he saw that he'd probably be released soon. So in 2 Corinthians, chapter 11, Paul spoke in verse 23 of being in prisons far more frequently. But up to the time this letter was sent, Paul had been in jail at Philippi. Other critical events in Paul's life are not mentioned in Acts, which opened the door for an imprisonment in Ephesus, but imprisonment could have been earlier, or really imprisonment would have been more likely in districts where Jewish opposition was stronger, and Luke was probably less informed about the earlier period of Paul's ministry than the Ephesian ministry. There's several different reasons why people would cling to the idea of a prison term in Ephesus, and Clement of Rome mentioned 7 imprisonments of Paul. The Marcionite prologue to Colossians said it was written from Ephesians or Ephesus. That some of the prison letters were written from Ephesus, but Colossians prologue is curious when compared with the attachment to Philemon, which said that the letter was from Rome. So, anyways, evidence is not strong enough to demonstrate an Ephesian imprisonment, though it wouldn't be impossible either. Let's jump right into Colossians. We're going to try to tackle this book in this brief video. Archaeologists have yet to excavate the site of Colossae. Not a lot of details about the city in light of that. Its precise size is unclear, but it couldn't have been very big. Colossae was located about 100 miles southeast from Ephesus in the Lycus Valley. Like its neighboring towns of Laodicea and Hierapolis, first century Colossae was plagued by earthquakes. It was kind of the least important city to which Paul sent a letter, I guess we would say. The origin of the church there is unclear. The gospel may have come to Colossae during Paul's 3-year stay at Ephesus in chapter 19 of Acts, but Paul himself had never been to Colossae. He says that in verse 4. also chapter 2, verse 1. Phrygian converts may have taken the gospel home immediately after Pentecost. Possibly the leader of the church was Epaphras, a native of the area who had labored for its evangelization. We see that in chapter 1, verse 7, 4:12. And references to him may have suggested that he started the church in Colossae. That's possible. At the time Paul wrote, Archippus seems to have charge of the church. In chapter 4, seems like he's the leader of the church there in Colossians 4:17. Gentiles made up the bulk of the church. We do know that. There were Jews in the area. Some of the church's problems appear related to Jewish misunderstandings of the gospel, and so that's part of what's going on too. What was the problem? Why did Epaphras seek out Paul and share his imprisonment for a while? Perhaps to encourage the apostle with news of the gospel spread in the Icus Valley, but more probably to get advice about this dangerous heresy, which was threatening the church at Colossae. People talk about the Colossian heresy. It was something that could be called a philosophy, according to chapter 2, verse 8. It's hard to kind of reconstruct a heresy like that without kind of doing mirror reading, where you kind of see what was being combated and thus assume that what that was. It seems that this was the heresy was about an intellectual exercise in human tradition, apart from the divine revelation contained in Scripture. Heretics required observance of special days and times and festivals, feast days, new moons, and Sabbath, according to chapter 2, verse 16. Legalism resulted in laws about food and drink were a part of it. Rigid asceticism seems to be the case, chapter 2, 23. Depriving, even punishing the body to keep the spirit in control. Perhaps heretics also insisted on circumcision, chapter 2, verse 11. A strange thing to write to a Gentile congregation unless someone told them that it was necessary for them to be circumcised. It involved the worship of angels, according to verse 18 of chapter 2. The Colossian heresy had to do with the rudiments of the world, or another translation, the elemental spirits of the universe. Something of that nature. Syncretism was common among the Greek people, so perhaps it was some kind of syncretistic Jewish Gnosticizing type of heresy. There were two problems, mainly. The first one was doctrinal, concerning the person of Jesus. The second was more practical, concerning the life of a Christian. So the epistle contains high Christology. All things were created not only by him, but for him. He is the image and possesses the fullness of God. He's the head of the church. Chapter 1, verses 15 through 19 tell us this. In the cross, Jesus triumphed over all enemies, verse 14 says. So it's Christology is at work there. The letter contains a sharp attack on ascetic practices. So those are thoughts. As far as the author, who's the author, the style, the vocabulary of Colossians differ a little bit from Paul's other letters. That is the case. So some people have argued against Paul being the author due to that. The heresy attacked in Colossians was 2nd century Gnosticism, some say, in which case Paul could not have written the letter, but tension eases if the Gnosticism Paul faced at Colossae was insipid instead of mature. So, and I think it was. I think that's what the letter indicates. But there's not a Pauline kind of, a thesis. It's... So some would say, well, he didn't talk about justification and go into detail about salvation and righteousness and all those things here. But Paul's discussion of the cosmic importance of Christ in Colossians is similar to other material, though. So I think external evidence, early Christians considered the letter Pauline, and really nobody ever questioned that till the 19th century. And internal evidence, Paul is mentioned as the writer a few times. He's an associate at the writing of Philemon, the author is. So that leads us to believe that pretty strong, solid reason for thinking that Paul wrote it. There's also something to be talked about here about this letter